Hello there and welcome to Theories Before Sleep. I'm so glad you're here. Maybe it's been a long day, your thoughts still circling, perhaps your mind won't settle, or you're simply curious about consciousness, seeking something peaceful to carry you toward rest. Whatever brought you here tonight, you're welcome. Tonight's journey is for you. You don't need to do anything but rest, and let your breath slow, your thoughts soften, and your body grow light. There's no effort required, no test at the end, just gentle exploration. We're going to explore 100 theories about consciousness, not in a rush, but slowly, gently. From ancient philosophical questions to modern quantum mysteries, each theory a quiet doorway into wonder. Some will feel familiar, others strange. All are presented to help you drift peacefully towards sleep. If these explorations help you unwind, consider liking and subscribing. It helps others find their way here too, one sleepy soul at a time. Now, let's begin. The first theory is waiting, patient and quiet. Consciousness emerges from the brain's electrical patterns, like music arising from vibrating strings. This theory, developed through decades of neuroscience research, suggests that what we experience as awareness is the result of billions of neurons firing in synchronized rhythms, creating waves of electrical activity that sweep across the cortex. When these patterns become complex enough, self-awareness emerges. The brain generates consciousness the way an orchestra generates a symphony, each neuron playing its small part in a vast coordinated performance. Different patterns create different states: waking consciousness, dreams, deep sleep. The theory is elegant in its simplicity, suggesting that consciousness is not mysterious but mechanical, not magical but physical. Yet even if true, it leaves us wondering why electrical patterns feel like anything at all. Why there's an inner experience accompanying these neural storms. The question lingers softly in the space between explanation and understanding. Consciousness might be fundamental to reality itself, woven into existence like gravity or electromagnetism. This ancient idea, revived by modern philosophers and physicists, proposes that awareness is not something brains create but something they tune into, a basic property of the universe that exists everywhere, in everything, at all times. Just as mass and energy are fundamental, so too might be experience. In this view, even particles possess some primitive form of awareness, and human consciousness is simply what this fundamental awareness becomes when organized through complex biological systems. The brain doesn't generate consciousness, but focuses it, shapes it, gives it personal character. This theory, called panpsychism, suggests the universe has never been unconscious, never been dead or empty. Awareness pervades everything, flowing through all things, and we are simply localized expressions of something far more vast, eternal, and strange. The brain might be a quantum computer, and consciousness emerges from quantum processes occurring in neural microtubules. Proposed by physicist Roger Penrose and anesthesiologist Stuart Hameroff, this theory suggests that tiny structures inside neurons can maintain quantum states, allowing the brain to perform calculations impossible for classical computers. Consciousness would arise when these quantum states collapse, creating moments of awareness from quantum possibilities. The theory connects mind to the deepest laws of physics, suggesting consciousness is woven into quantum reality itself. If true, then awareness participates in the quantum nature of existence, collapsing possibilities into actualities through the simple act of observation. The brain would be using quantum mechanics to generate subjective experience, performing operations at the boundary between quantum and classical worlds. Critics argue quantum states can't survive in warm, wet brains, but the theory persists, beautiful and strange, suggesting consciousness touches the fundamental fabric of reality. Consciousness is what information feels like when it's integrated in complex ways. Neuroscientist Giulio Tononi developed this mathematical theory, called integrated information theory. which proposes that any system integrating information has some degree of consciousness. The more integrated and complex the information processing, the richer the consciousness. A single photodiode has minimal consciousness because its information is simple. A human brain has vast consciousness because billions of neurons integrate information in intricate patterns. The theory provides equations to measure consciousness, suggesting it's quantifiable, mathematical, objective. What makes consciousness special is not its substance but its structure, not what it's made of but how it's organized. Even artificial systems could be conscious if they integrate information sufficiently. The theory transforms consciousness from mystery to mathematics, from philosophical puzzle to physical property. Yet somehow this makes consciousness even more wondrous, suggesting the universe is full of experience. Everywhere information integrates, everywhere patterns form. We might be philosophical zombies, behaving consciously without actually experiencing anything, and we'd never know. This thought experiment, proposed by philosopher David Chalmers, imagines beings physically identical to us, processing information identically, behaving identically, but with no inner experience, no subjective awareness, no feelings or sensations. They would claim to be conscious, discuss consciousness, even write papers about consciousness, all while experiencing nothing. The zombie thought experiment highlights what philosophers call the hard problem, explaining why physical processes feel like anything at all. Science can explain behavior, information processing, neural patterns, but not why these create subjective experience. The theory suggests consciousness might be something extra, something beyond physical explanation, a feature of reality that science cannot capture. Or perhaps we are the zombies, and consciousness is an illusion we tell ourselves. The question dissolves gently into mystery, unanswerable and strange. Consciousness might be the universe observing itself, awareness folding back to experience its own existence. This poetic theory suggests that when matter organizes into brains, the cosmos gains the ability to know itself, to reflect on its own nature, to wonder about its own origins. We are the universe's way of looking at itself, thinking about itself, asking questions about itself. Every conscious being is a window through which existence peers at its own reflection. In this view, consciousness is not separate from physical reality, but is what physical reality becomes when it achieves sufficient complexity. The universe spent billions of years unconscious, matter swirling in darkness, until finally it organized into forms capable of awareness. Now it experiences itself through countless perspectives, each one a unique angle on existence. This theory offers no mechanism, no explanation, only a perspective shift that transforms our relationship to reality. We are not separate observers, but participants, not outside looking in, but inside looking around. Free will might be an illusion created by consciousness to make sense of deterministic brain processes. Neuroscientist Benjamin Libet discovered that brain activity initiating voluntary actions begins before we consciously decide to act, suggesting our sense of choosing is a post hoc rationalization. The brain decides, then consciousness creates the experience of deciding. This theory proposes that consciousness is not in control, but is a narrator, constructing stories about why we do what we do, giving us the feeling of agency, even though our actions are determined by prior causes. We feel free because consciousness doesn't have access to the deterministic processes underlying behavior. The experience of choice is real, but the actual choosing happens unconsciously, mechanically, inevitably. Yet even if true, the illusion of free will might be necessary for functioning, for moral reasoning, for human society. The theory leaves us floating in strange territory between freedom and determinism, neither fully free nor fully determined, but something more subtle, more layered. Consciousness might exist in a quantum superposition until observed, collapsing into definite states only through interaction. This extension of quantum mechanics to consciousness suggests that mental states exist in multiple possibilities simultaneously until something forces them into actuality. Your thoughts might be quantum, existing in superposition, becoming definite only when expressed or observed. This would explain the strange fluidity of consciousness, how thoughts seem uncertain until articulated, how awareness shifts and changes depending on attention. The theory connects mind directly to quantum reality, suggesting consciousness follows the same rules as particles and waves. If true, then observing your own thoughts changes them, and introspection is a quantum measurement, collapsing mental possibilities into definite experiences. The boundary between quantum and classical would run through consciousness itself, making awareness the bridge between possibility and actuality. The theory remains speculative, impossible to test with current methods, but it offers a beautiful vision of mind as quantum, fluid, uncertain until observed. Consciousness might be generated by the brain's default mode network, active when we're not focused on external tasks. This network, discovered through brain imaging, becomes active during mind-wandering, daydreaming, self-reflection, and rest. Some researchers propose that this network generates the sense of self, the feeling of being someone, the narrative continuity we experience as consciousness. When we focus externally, the network quiets, and consciousness becomes more about the world than the self. When we rest, it activates, and consciousness turns inward, creating the experience of introspection. The theory suggests consciousness has two modes: external awareness and internal reflection, each generated by different brain networks. Damage to the default mode network disrupts self-awareness, supporting the theory. Yet questions remain about why these neural patterns create subjective experience, why there's something it's like to be a network of firing neurons. The explanation feels incomplete, like describing music by listing the instruments without capturing the sound itself. The stream of consciousness might be constructed from discrete moments stitched together seamlessly, like frames in a film. Philosopher William James described consciousness as a continuous flow, but modern theories suggest it might be discontinuous, composed of brief snapshots that the brain integrates into the illusion of continuity. Each moment of awareness might last only milliseconds, with consciousness jumping from moment to moment so quickly we perceive smooth flow. This would explain why attention seems to sample the world rather than perceiving everything simultaneously, why we can only focus on one thing at a time despite feeling continuously aware. The brain would be creating the experience of flow from discrete samples, much like a movie creates the illusion of motion from still frames. If true, consciousness is not truly continuous, but is a construction, an illusion of flow created by rapid sampling. The theory transforms our experience of time, suggesting the present moment is not a point but a series of points, not a flow but a sequence, not continuous but stitched together so skillfully we never notice the gaps. Consciousness might require language, emerging only in beings capable of symbolic thought and self-narration. This theory proposes that pre-linguistic animals and human infants lack true consciousness, experiencing sensations and reactions but not subjective awareness, not the sense of being someone experiencing something. Language allows us to create an internal narrator, a voice that comments on experience, creating the illusion of a unified self observing the world. Without language, there might be experience but not consciousness of experience, sensation but not awareness of sensation. The theory is controversial, seeming to deny consciousness to animals and babies, yet it highlights something important about human consciousness: its narrative quality, its linguistic structure, its dependence on symbols and concepts. Perhaps there are different types of consciousness, and the kind humans possess is uniquely linguistic, uniquely narrative. Or perhaps consciousness exists on a spectrum, with language adding layers of complexity to something more basic and universal. The question drifts softly into the space between experience and expression, between feeling and knowing. Dreams might be consciousness untethered from sensory input, revealing its pure structure without external constraints. During REM sleep, the brain generates vivid experiences without sensory data, creating entire worlds from memory and imagination. This suggests consciousness doesn't require external stimulation, but can operate independently, generating its own content, its own reality. Dreams reveal what consciousness does when left alone. It creates narratives, constructs spaces, invents characters, all without input from the outside world. Some theories propose that dreaming is consciousness in its most basic form, and waking consciousness is dreaming constrained by sensory data. We're always dreaming, but during waking hours, sensory input guides and constrains the dream, keeping it aligned with external reality. At night, those constraints release, and consciousness reveals its creative nature. Dreams might be windows into the generative processes underlying all consciousness, showing us how awareness constructs experience from neural activity. The theory suggests consciousness is fundamentally creative, fundamentally generative, always constructing reality rather than passively receiving it. Consciousness might emerge from feedback loops in the brain, information cycling through neural networks in recursive patterns. This theory proposes that awareness arises when the brain processes information about its own processing, creating loops of self-reference. Simple systems process information once. Input leads to output. Complex conscious systems process information, then process information about that processing, then process information about that meta-processing, creating layers of recursion. Consciousness would be what it feels like to be a system observing itself, a brain monitoring its own activity. The theory explains why consciousness seems self-referential, why awareness is always aware of itself, why we can think about thinking, feel about feeling, know that we know. Each loop adds depth to consciousness, creating the rich inner experience we associate with awareness. The loops would generate the sense of self, the feeling of being someone, by creating a stable pattern that persists through time. Consciousness becomes a strange loop, a system that contains itself, that refers to itself, that observes itself observing. Altered states might reveal consciousness's flexibility, showing that normal waking awareness is just one possible configuration among many. Meditation, psychedelics, sensory deprivation, and extreme experiences can dramatically change consciousness, suggesting it's not fixed but fluid, not singular but multiple. These altered states aren't distortions of normal consciousness, but alternative modes, each revealing different aspects of awareness. In meditation, consciousness becomes spacious and quiet. On psychedelics, it becomes fluid and boundary dissolving. In flow states, it becomes absorbed and timeless. Each state offers insights into consciousness's nature, showing that the everyday waking state is not privileged, but is simply one configuration among countless possibilities. The brain can generate many types of consciousness, each with its own character, its own way of experiencing reality. This suggests consciousness is like water, taking different forms depending on conditions: ice, liquid, vapor, each still water, but structured differently. The theory invites us to explore consciousness's vast territory, to discover the many ways awareness can organize itself. Consciousness might be a simulation running on the brain's neural hardware, a virtual reality generated for evolutionary purposes. This theory proposes that what we experience as consciousness is not reality itself, but a model of reality, a simplified representation optimized for survival rather than truth. The brain doesn't show us the world as it is, but constructs a useful fiction, a simulation that highlights relevant information and ignores everything else. Colors don't exist in the external world, only wavelengths of light. The brain creates colors to help us distinguish objects. Similarly, consciousness might be entirely constructed, a user interface hiding the complex reality underneath. We experience a simulation because direct access to reality would be overwhelming and useless. The brain evolved to keep us alive, not to show us truth. This theory suggests consciousness is fundamentally illusory, a convenient fiction, but one so convincing we mistake it for reality. Yet even if consciousness is a simulation, the experience itself is real. The simulation is all we have, all we can ever know. The unity of consciousness might be an illusion, with awareness actually divided into multiple parallel streams we experience as one. Split-brain patients, whose corpus callosum connecting the hemispheres has been severed, seem to have two separate consciousnesses, each controlling different sides of the body, each with different preferences and knowledge. This suggests normal consciousness might also be divided but integrated so seamlessly we perceive unity. Multiple processes run in parallel. Multiple streams of awareness flow simultaneously, but they're bound together into the illusion of a single unified self. The left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing, but integration creates the feeling that one person controls both. This theory challenges our intuitive sense of being a unified self, suggesting we're actually a collection of processes, a parliament of subselves, a chorus of voices that speak in unison. The unity we experience is constructed, stitched together from fragments, creating the illusion of a single consciousness from multiple streams. Yet the illusion is perfect, seamless, and we never notice the seams. If your mind is starting to wander, that's perfectly fine. These theories aren't meant to be memorized, only experienced, like watching clouds drift across the sky. Consciousness might be what it's like to be information processing itself, the subjective side of computation. This theory proposes that any system processing information has some form of experience, and consciousness is simply what information processing feels like from the inside. A thermostat processing temperature information has minimal consciousness. A brain processing vast amounts of information has rich consciousness. The complexity of experience corresponds to the complexity of information processing. This suggests consciousness is not special to biological systems, but could exist in artificial intelligence, in computers, in any system that processes information. The theory makes consciousness ubiquitous, present wherever information is processed, but varying in richness and complexity. It explains why consciousness correlates with brain activity. More processing equals more consciousness. Yet it leaves the hard problem unsolved, failing to explain why information processing should feel like anything at all. Why should computation have an inner life? The question remains, floating gently in the space between mechanism and experience, between function and feeling. Consciousness might be an emergent property, arising from complex systems in ways that cannot be reduced to component parts. Just as wetness emerges from water molecules, but no single molecule is wet, consciousness might emerge from neural networks, but no single neuron is conscious. Emergence theory suggests that at certain levels of complexity, new properties appear that are not present in simpler systems, properties that cannot be predicted from studying components in isolation. Consciousness would be such a property, emerging when neurons organize into sufficiently complex networks. The theory explains why consciousness seems reducible, why we can't find it by studying individual neurons, why it feels like more than the sum of its parts. It's not in the parts, but in the relationships between parts, not in the neurons, but in the patterns they form. Yet emergence remains somewhat mysterious, a label for something we don't fully understand. We can describe emergence but not explain it, observe it but not predict it. The theory names the mystery without solving it, offering a framework rather than an answer. The hard problem of consciousness might be unsolvable because subjective experience cannot be captured by objective description. Philosopher David Chalmers distinguished between easy problems, like explaining behavior and information processing, and the hard problem, explaining why there's something it's like to be conscious. Science can explain neural correlates of consciousness, but not why those correlates produce subjective experience. The hard problem might be intrinsically unsolvable, because consciousness is fundamentally subjective, and science is fundamentally objective. No amount of objective knowledge about brains can explain subjective experience because the two domains are categorically different. This theory suggests consciousness will always remain partially mysterious, not because we lack knowledge, but because the question itself transcends scientific method. We can study consciousness's correlates, its functions, its effects, but never its essence, never what it's actually like to be conscious. The theory invites acceptance of mystery, suggesting some questions have no answers, some territories remain forever unexplored. The hard problem might be a permanent feature of existence, a boundary science cannot cross. Consciousness might be timeless, experiencing an eternal now rather than flowing through time sequentially. Physicist Julian Barber proposed that time is an illusion, and reality consists of a vast space of possible moments, all equally real, none more present than others. If true, consciousness doesn't move through time but exists in each moment separately, creating the illusion of flow by remembering past moments. Each moment contains a complete consciousness, with memories of previous moments, but those previous moments are not past, just other locations in the space of possibilities. The flow of time is a story consciousness tells itself, a narrative constructed from static moments. This theory dissolves the distinction between past, present, and future, suggesting all moments exist simultaneously, and consciousness samples them in sequence, creating the experience of time. It's a strange and beautiful idea, suggesting we're not travelling through time but existing in many moments at once. Each moment a complete world, each consciousness a timeless presence, experiencing eternity as sequence. The theory transforms time from reality to illusion, from flow to structure. Consciousness might be the universe's way of increasing complexity, driving evolution toward greater awareness and understanding. This teleological theory suggests consciousness is not an accident, but a purpose, not a byproduct, but a goal. The universe evolves toward consciousness, toward awareness, toward self-understanding. From simple matter to complex brains, from unconscious processes to conscious reflection, reality moves in a direction, and that direction is toward greater consciousness. This theory gives meaning to evolution, suggesting it's not random but purposeful, not blind but guided by an intrinsic tendency toward awareness. Consciousness would be the universe waking up, matter becoming aware of itself, existence achieving self-knowledge. The theory is unprovable and unfalsifiable, more philosophy than science. But it offers a narrative framework for understanding consciousness's place in the cosmos. We are not accidents but fulfillments, not random but inevitable, not meaningless, but essential to the universe's self-realization. The theory provides comfort in its purposefulness, suggesting consciousness matters, that awareness is not just an epiphenomenon but the point of everything. The binding problem asks how separate neural processes combine into unified conscious experience, and the answer might reshape our understanding of consciousness entirely. Different brain regions process color, shape, motion, and sound separately, yet we experience a unified world, not fragmented perceptions. How do these separate streams bind into one experience? Some theories propose a master area that integrates everything, but no such area has been found. Others suggest synchronized neural firing creates temporary binding, different regions oscillating in phase. The binding problem highlights consciousness's mystery. How does physical separation become experiential unity? How do many become one? The question touches the heart of consciousness, revealing the gap between neural mechanism and subjective experience. Even if we discover how binding works mechanically, we might not understand why it feels unified, why there's a single subject experiencing multiple inputs. The binding problem might be another version of the hard problem, another way of asking why physical processes create subjective experience. The question lingers softly, unanswered and patient. Consciousness might be discontinuous, with gaps we don't notice because memory stitches moments together seamlessly. During blinks, saccadic eye movements, and brief lapses, consciousness might cease, then restart, but we experience continuity because memory fills the gaps. We remember being conscious continuously, so we believe we were, but the actual experience might be punctuated by microgaps, brief moments of unconsciousness too short to notice. This theory suggests consciousness is more like a flickering light than a steady glow, but the flicker is so rapid we perceive constancy. The gaps would be invisible because there's no consciousness to experience them, no awareness to notice the absence of awareness. When consciousness returns, it assumes it was always there, creating the illusion of continuity. The theory challenges our intuitive sense of uninterrupted awareness, suggesting consciousness is fragmented, discontinuous, constantly stopping and starting. Yet the illusion is perfect, and we live our lives convinced of continuity, never suspecting the gaps, never noticing the flicker. Reality might be more discontinuous than we imagine, more punctuated than we feel. The attention schema theory proposes that consciousness is the brain's model of its own attention, a simplified representation used for control and prediction. Just as the brain creates a body schema to model the body's position and movement, it creates an attention schema to model where attention is focused and why. Consciousness would be this self-model, the brain's way of keeping track of its own attention. When we say we're conscious of something, we're reporting the brain's model of what it's attending to. This theory explains consciousness's relationship to attention. We're conscious of what we attend to because consciousness is attention's self-model. It also explains why consciousness feels like something. The model includes not just what we're attending to, but the sense of attending, the feeling of focus. The theory makes consciousness functional rather than mysterious, a tool the brain uses to manage attention efficiently. Yet it leaves questions unanswered. Why should a self-model feel like anything? Why should representing attention create subjective experience? The theory explains consciousness's function, but not its phenomenology, its purpose, but not its presence. Global workspace theory suggests consciousness arises when information becomes globally available to multiple brain systems simultaneously. Unconscious processes occur in specialized modules working in parallel, but conscious processes broadcast information to the entire brain, making it available for reasoning, memory, action planning, and verbal report. Consciousness would be this global broadcast, this moment when information moves from local processing to brain-wide availability. The theory explains why consciousness is limited. Only one thing can be broadcast globally at a time, creating the bottleneck of attention. It explains why consciousness is unified. The global broadcast integrates information from multiple sources. It explains why consciousness is reportable. Globally available information can reach language systems. The theory transforms consciousness from mystery to mechanism, from ineffable quality to functional process. Yet it assumes consciousness equals global availability, without explaining why global availability should feel like anything. The theory describes what consciousness does, but not what consciousness is, its function, but not its nature. The gap between description and explanation remains quiet and persistent. Consciousness might be a quantum field pervading space, and brains are simply receivers tuning into this universal awareness. This speculative theory combines quantum mechanics with consciousness, proposing that awareness is not generated by brains, but exists as a fundamental field, like electromagnetic or gravitational fields. Brains don't create consciousness, but modulate it, shape it, give it individual character. This would explain why consciousness seems irreducible to neural activity, It's not produced by neurons but accessed through them. The theory suggests consciousness is everywhere, always, and brains are like radios receiving and transforming universal awareness into personal experience. Different brain configurations tune into different aspects of the consciousness field, creating different types of awareness. Damage to the brain doesn't destroy consciousness but disrupts reception, like damaging a radio doesn't destroy the broadcast. The theory is deeply controversial, lacking empirical support, but it offers a beautiful vision of consciousness as fundamental, universal, eternal. It suggests we're not separate islands of awareness, but expressions of something vast and unified, temporary individuations of universal consciousness. The illusionist position argues that consciousness as we understand it doesn't exist. What exists is simply information processing we mistakenly interpret as subjective experience. Philosopher Daniel Dennett championed this view, suggesting that when we think we're experiencing qualia, subjective feels, we're actually just processing information and creating the illusion of inner experience. There's no hard problem because there's nothing to explain. Consciousness as we conceive it is a cognitive illusion, a trick the brain plays on itself. What we call consciousness is just the brain's self-model, its way of representing its own states. The illusion is so convincing we believe in it absolutely, but it's still an illusion. This theory dissolves the mystery of consciousness by denying its existence, at least as traditionally conceived. Critics argue the position is incoherent. How can an illusion exist without someone experiencing the illusion? But illusionists respond that the experiencing itself is the illusion, a conceptual confusion rather than a real phenomenon. The theory is provocative, challenging our deepest intuitions about our own inner lives, suggesting we're fundamentally mistaken about what we are. If your eyes are growing heavy, don't fight it. Sleep is welcome here. The theories will continue whether you hear them or not, a quiet voice in the darkness. Higher-order theories propose that consciousness requires thoughts about thoughts, meta-representations that take first-order mental states as their objects. To be conscious of pain, you need not just the pain signal, but a thought about that pain signal. A higher-order representation that makes the first-order state conscious. Without this meta-representation, experiences would occur unconsciously, processed but not experienced. Consciousness would be the brain representing its own states to itself, creating awareness through self-representation. This explains why consciousness seems reflexive, why awareness is always aware of itself. Consciousness is self-representation, the brain taking itself as its own object. The theory distinguishes between unconscious and conscious processing. Both involve information processing, but only conscious processing involves meta-representation. Yet questions remain. What makes the higher-order thought conscious? Does it require a third-order thought about it? The theory risks infinite regress, requiring endless levels of meta-representation. Most versions stop at the second level, claiming higher-order thoughts are conscious simply by being higher-order, but this seems arbitrary. The theory illuminates consciousness's reflexive nature, but struggles to explain why meta-representation should create subjective experience. Consciousness might be the brain's error correction mechanism, constantly comparing predictions to reality and updating its models. This predictive processing theory suggests the brain is always generating predictions about incoming sensory data, and consciousness arises from prediction errors, moments when reality doesn't match expectations. We become conscious of things that surprise us, that violate predictions, that require model updates. Routine predictable experiences remain unconscious, processed automatically without awareness. Consciousness would be the brain's way of highlighting what needs attention, what requires learning, what challenges current models. This explains why consciousness is selective, why we're not aware of everything, why attention focuses on novelty and surprise. The theory makes consciousness functional. It exists to facilitate learning and adaptation, yet it doesn't explain why prediction errors should feel like anything, why model updating should have subjective character, The theory describes when consciousness occurs, but not what consciousness is, its timing, but not its nature. Still, it offers insights into consciousness's relationship to attention, learning, and surprise, suggesting awareness serves specific computational purposes rather than being an inexplicable byproduct. Consciousness might exist in degrees, distributed across a spectrum from minimal awareness to rich human consciousness. This gradualist view suggests consciousness is not binary, not present or absent, but exists in varying intensities and complexities. Simple organisms have minimal consciousness, just basic sensation without reflection. More complex animals have richer consciousness, including emotions and memories. Humans have the richest consciousness, including self-awareness and abstract thought. The theory avoids the hard boundary problem. At what point does consciousness emerge? Instead, it proposes consciousness exists everywhere in some form, increasing gradually with neural complexity. Even simple systems might have minimal experience, and consciousness grows richer as systems become more complex. This view is more consistent with evolutionary continuity, avoiding the implausible suggestion that consciousness suddenly appeared at some point. It suggests consciousness has been present throughout evolution, growing gradually, becoming richer and more complex over time. The theory makes consciousness ubiquitous but varied, present in many forms, expressed differently at different levels of complexity. It transforms the question from whether something is conscious to how conscious it is, from binary to spectrum. The explanatory gap refers to the conceptual chasm between physical descriptions of brain processes and subjective experiences, and it might be unbridgeable. We can describe neural activity in complete physical detail, yet this description seems to leave out the subjective feel, the what-it's-likeness of experience. Joseph Levine coined the term to describe this gap between third-person objective descriptions and first-person subjective experiences. Even complete knowledge of brain processes might not explain why those processes feel like anything. The gap might reflect a fundamental limit of scientific explanation, a boundary where objective methods cannot reach subjective reality, or it might reflect limitations in our current concepts, which will be overcome by future theories. The explanatory gap is closely related to the hard problem, but focuses on the conceptual rather than metaphysical difficulty. It asks whether any physical explanation could ever satisfy us as an account of consciousness, whether any amount of neural detail could close the gap between description and experience. The gap persists, quiet and vast, between what we can explain and what we can experience, between knowledge and understanding. Consciousness might be substrate independent, capable of existing in any system with the right functional organization, regardless of physical implementation. This functionalist view suggests consciousness depends on information processing patterns, not specific materials. If a computer could replicate the functional organization of a brain, it would be conscious, even though it's made of silicon instead of neurons. Consciousness would be about software, not hardware, about patterns rather than substances. This theory supports the possibility of artificial consciousness, suggesting machines could be genuinely aware if they process information in the right ways. It also suggests consciousness could be uploaded, transferred from biological brains to digital systems, because consciousness is the pattern, not the medium. Critics argue this ignores consciousness's physical basis, assuming function is all that matters. But functionalists respond that consciousness is fundamentally about relationships and patterns, which can be realized in multiple physical forms. The theory makes consciousness portable, transferable, independent of specific materials. It suggests consciousness is more abstract than we think, more about organization than substance, more about patterns than particles. The phenomenal concept strategy attempts to explain why consciousness seems mysterious by arguing we have special concepts for phenomenal experiences that create an illusion of explanatory gap. These phenomenal concepts form through direct introspection. are cognitively isolated from physical concepts learned through science. When we think about consciousness using phenomenal concepts, it seems irreducible to physical processes. But this is a conceptual illusion. Consciousness is physical, but our way of thinking about it makes it seem non-physical. The gap between physical and phenomenal is in our concepts, not in reality. This theory attempts to reconcile physicalism with the intuition that consciousness is special, suggesting consciousness is physical, but our concepts make it seem otherwise. Critics argue this doesn't solve the hard problem but merely relocates it. Why should phenomenal concepts exist? Why should introspection generate concepts that feel irreducible? The strategy might explain the illusion of mystery without explaining consciousness itself. Yet it offers a way to maintain physicalism while acknowledging consciousness's apparent specialness, suggesting the mystery is epistemological rather than metaphysical, about knowing rather than being. Consciousness might be nature's solution to the problem of flexible behavior in unpredictable environments, an evolutionary adaptation for dealing with novelty. Unconscious processes handle routine situations efficiently, but consciousness emerges when situations are novel, ambiguous, or conflicting, requiring flexible responses. Consciousness would be the brain's way of creating a workspace for deliberation, a space where options can be considered before acting. This theory makes consciousness functional. It exists because it solves specific problems, because it enhances survival in complex environments. Animals with consciousness can simulate possible futures, evaluate options, plan actions, all of which require the kind of flexible processing consciousness provides. The theory explains why consciousness is limited and selective. It's metabolically expensive, used only when necessary, when automatic processes are insufficient. Yet it doesn't explain why this functional capacity should feel like anything, why flexible processing should have subjective character. The theory describes consciousness's function but not its phenomenology, what it does but not what it is. Still, it grounds consciousness in evolution, suggesting awareness is not accidental but adaptive, not mysterious but useful. If some theories feel confusing, that's okay. They're meant to be felt more than understood, like music you don't need to analyze to enjoy. The access phenomenal distinction separates two aspects of consciousness: access consciousness, which is information available for reasoning and report, and phenomenal consciousness, which is subjective experience itself. Philosopher Ned Block argued these are distinct. You can have access without phenomenology, and phenomenology without access. Access consciousness is functional, about information processing. Phenomenal consciousness is experiential, about what things feel like. Many theories explain access consciousness but not phenomenal consciousness, describing when information becomes reportable, but not why it feels like anything. The distinction clarifies debates about consciousness, showing that different theories address different aspects. Some theories are about access, explaining information availability. Others are about phenomenology, explaining subjective experience. The hard problem concerns phenomenal consciousness specifically. Why does information access feel like anything? The distinction reveals that consciousness might not be a single thing, but multiple phenomena that usually occur together but can potentially separate. It suggests we might solve some aspects of consciousness while leaving others mysterious, explaining access while phenomenology remains inexplicable. The distinction brings clarity to confusion, separating tractable problems from intractable ones. Consciousness might be a form of self-organizing criticality, a system poised at the edge between order and chaos where complexity maximizes. Brain networks seem to operate near critical points, where small changes can cascade through the system, creating rich dynamics without collapsing into either rigid order or random chaos. Consciousness might emerge at this critical point, where the brain is maximally responsive and flexible. Too much order creates rigidity, too much chaos creates noise, but at the critical point, the brain can process information optimally, creating the conditions for consciousness. This theory connects consciousness to complexity science, suggesting awareness arises at specific dynamical regimes where systems exhibit particular patterns. The brain tunes itself to criticality, maintaining this delicate balance where consciousness flourishes. The theory explains why consciousness is fragile, easily disrupted by anesthesia or injury. It exists at a narrow critical point, and pushing the brain away from this point eliminates consciousness. Yet it doesn't explain why criticality should feel like anything, why complex dynamics should create subjective experience. The theory describes consciousness's physical substrate, but not its phenomenal nature. Consciousness might be what it's like to be a biological organism maintaining homeostasis, the subjective side of self-regulation. Antonio Damasio proposed that consciousness evolved to represent the body's internal states, creating feelings that guide behavior towards survival. Primordial consciousness is the feeling of being alive, the sense of bodily existence. Core consciousness adds awareness of objects in relation to the body. Extended consciousness adds memory and anticipation, creating a sense of self across time. All forms of consciousness are rooted in the body, in the brain's representations of physiological states. Emotions are conscious because they represent bodily changes. Thoughts are conscious when they affect bodily states. Consciousness would be fundamentally embodied, inseparable from the body's regulatory processes. This theory grounds consciousness in biology, suggesting awareness evolved to help organisms maintain life, to feel what the body needs. It explains consciousness's emotional quality, why experiences have valence, why things feel good or bad. Yet it struggles to explain why bodily representation should feel like anything, why self-regulation should have subjective character. The theory connects consciousness to life, but doesn't fully explain the connection. The cognitive closure hypothesis suggests humans might be constitutionally incapable of understanding consciousness, just as rats cannot understand quantum mechanics. Philosopher Colin McGinn argued that every species has cognitive limits, problems their minds cannot solve, and consciousness might be such a problem for humans. We might lack the concepts, the cognitive architecture, the mental tools needed to understand consciousness. The problem isn't that consciousness is mysterious, but that we're limited, unable to grasp its nature with our particular type of mind. This theory is pessimistic, suggesting consciousness will remain forever mysterious, not because it's intrinsically mysterious, but because we're intrinsically limited. Other beings with different cognitive architectures might understand consciousness easily, finding it obvious, wondering why we struggled. The theory explains persistent mystery without invoking dualism or non-physical properties. Consciousness is physical, but understanding it requires cognitive capacities we don't possess. The theory invites humility, suggesting our limitations rather than reality's strangeness. Yet it's untestable. How could we know if we're cognitively closed? The hypothesis itself might be beyond our capacity to evaluate, creating a strange loop of unknowability. Consciousness might be the brain's way of creating a unified agent from multiple competing processes, a virtual CEO coordinating specialized departments. The brain contains many modules, each processing information independently, often with conflicting goals. Consciousness would be the system that integrates these modules, resolves conflicts, and creates coherent behavior. Without consciousness, the brain would be a committee without a leader, multiple processes pulling in different directions. Consciousness creates the illusion of a unified self, a single decision-maker, even though the reality is multiple processes negotiating and compromising. This theory explains consciousness's executive function, its role in decision-making and action control. It explains why consciousness feels like being someone, like having a perspective. It's the brain's way of representing itself as a unified agent. Yet it doesn't explain why this integration should feel like anything, why creating a virtual CEO should produce subjective experience. The theory describes consciousness's function, but not its phenomenology, what it does, but not what it is. Still, it offers insights into consciousness's role in creating coherent behavior from neural multiplicity. The Bayesian brain hypothesis suggests consciousness is the brain's best guess about reality, a probabilistic inference constantly updated by sensory evidence. The brain doesn't passively receive information, but actively predicts incoming data, using prior beliefs to interpret ambiguous sensory signals. Consciousness would be this inference process, the brain's current best hypothesis about what's happening. Perception is controlled hallucination, constrained by sensory data but fundamentally generated by the brain's predictions. This theory explains why consciousness is interpretive, why the same sensory input can produce different experiences depending on context and expectations. It explains perceptual illusions. The brain's predictions override sensory evidence, creating experiences that don't match reality. Consciousness would be the brain's model of reality, constantly refined by prediction errors. The theory connects consciousness to inference, suggesting awareness is fundamentally about making sense of ambiguous data. Yet it doesn't explain why inference should feel like anything, why probabilistic computation should create subjective experience. The theory describes consciousness's computational structure, but not its phenomenal nature, its information processing, but not its experiential quality. Consciousness might be a quantum phenomenon requiring quantum mechanics to explain, with the brain maintaining quantum coherence despite warm, wet conditions. Some theories propose that consciousness involves quantum entanglement between neurons, quantum superposition of mental states, or quantum effects in microtubules. These theories suggest consciousness cannot be explained by classical physics, requiring quantum mechanics' strange properties. Quantum consciousness theories are controversial, with many physicists arguing quantum effects cannot survive in biological systems, but proponents point to recent discoveries of quantum effects in photosynthesis and bird navigation, suggesting biology might exploit quantum mechanics in unexpected ways. If consciousness is quantum, it would explain why consciousness seems irreducible to classical computation, why it has strange properties like unity and subjectivity. Quantum mechanics is fundamentally probabilistic and non-local, properties that might be necessary for consciousness. Yet quantum consciousness theories remain speculative, lacking strong empirical support. They offer intriguing possibilities but haven't solved consciousness's mysteries. The theories suggest consciousness touches the deepest levels of physics, connecting mind to the quantum fabric of reality itself. Consciousness might be an illusion in the sense that it doesn't work the way we think it does, though the experience itself is real. We believe consciousness is unified, continuous, and transparent, but these beliefs might be false. Consciousness might be fragmentary, discontinuous, and opaque, but it creates the illusion of unity, continuity, and transparency. The experience is real, but our understanding of the experience is mistaken. This moderate illusionism suggests consciousness exists but is widely misunderstood, that our intuitions about consciousness are unreliable. We think we have direct access to our mental states, but introspection is interpretive and error-prone. We think consciousness is continuous, but it's punctuated by gaps we don't notice. We think consciousness is unified, but it's multiple streams bound together. The theory preserves consciousness's reality, while questioning our beliefs about it. It suggests the hard problem might arise from false assumptions about consciousness's nature. If we correct these assumptions, the problem might dissolve. The theory is appealing because it acknowledges consciousness's reality while explaining why it seems mysterious. We're confused about what consciousness actually is. The self might be a narrative construction, a story consciousness tells about its own experiences to create coherent identity. We experience ourselves as continuous persons with stable identities, but this might be an illusion created by memory and narration. The self is not a thing, but a process, not an entity, but a story, constantly revised and updated to maintain coherence. Consciousness creates this narrative self to make sense of experiences, to connect past and future, to create the sense of being someone. Without this narrative, experiences would be disconnected, lacking the unity we associate with personal identity. The theory explains why the self feels substantial, yet proves elusive when examined closely. It's not substantial, but narrative, not a thing we have, but a story we tell. Memory provides the material, consciousness weaves it into narrative, creating the illusion of a continuous self. Yet even if the self is narrative, the narrative itself is real, and the experience of being someone is genuine. The theory doesn't eliminate the self, but reconceives it, transforming it from entity to process, from substance to story. The self becomes something we do rather than something we are, a continuous creation rather than a fixed fact. Consciousness might be the brain's way of creating meaning, of transforming information into significance through subjective interpretation. Information is meaningless without interpretation, without someone to whom it matters. Consciousness provides this interpretation, this mattering, transforming objective data into subjective significance. A tree falling in the forest creates sound waves, but consciousness transforms those waves into the experience of sound, into something that means something to someone. This theory suggests consciousness is fundamentally about meaning-making, about creating significance from meaningless physical processes. The brain processes information unconsciously, but consciousness adds meaning, adds the sense that information matters, that it's about something. This explains why consciousness has intentionality, why experiences are always about something, why awareness has content. Consciousness transforms the physical into the meaningful, the objective into the subjective, the mechanical into the experiential. Yet the theory doesn't fully explain how this transformation occurs, how meaning emerges from meaninglessness, how mattering arises from matter. It names the mystery without solving it, describing consciousness's function without explaining its nature. There's no test at the end. No need to prove you are listening. Your mind can wander where it wants, to memories, to dreams, to nothing at all. Consciousness might require embodiment, inseparable from having a body that interacts with the world through sensation and action. Disembodied consciousness might be impossible, not just practically but conceptually, because consciousness is fundamentally about being a body in the world. The brain doesn't generate consciousness in isolation, but through constant interaction with the body and environment. Consciousness is enacted through bodily engagement, not computed in neural isolation. This embodied cognition approach suggests consciousness is not in the brain, but distributed across brain-body environment systems. Perception is not passive reception, but active exploration. Thought is not abstract computation, but grounded in bodily metaphors and sensoromotor experience. The theory challenges the idea that consciousness could be uploaded or implemented in non-biological systems, suggesting consciousness requires specific types of embodiment. Yet it's unclear how essential embodiment is. Could consciousness exist in different types of bodies? Could artificial bodies support consciousness? The theory grounds consciousness in physicality, in the messy reality of biological existence. But questions remain about how essential specific types of embodiment are. It suggests consciousness is more than computation, more than information processing, something that requires flesh and blood and interaction with the world. Consciousness might be a social phenomenon, emerging through interaction with other conscious beings rather than in isolated brains. We develop consciousness through social engagement, through language, through seeing ourselves reflected in others' responses. Infants might lack full consciousness, developing it gradually through social interaction. This theory suggests consciousness is not purely internal, but interpersonal, not individual, but collective. We become conscious by being treated as conscious, by participating in social practices that assume consciousness. Language is particularly important, providing the concepts and categories through which we understand our own experiences. Without social interaction, without language, consciousness might not develop fully, remaining primitive and limited. The theory explains consciousness's social dimensions, why we're so attuned to others' mental states, why social isolation is so damaging. Yet it seems to make consciousness dependent on contingent social factors, suggesting someone raised in isolation might lack consciousness, which seems wrong. The theory highlights consciousness's social aspects without fully explaining its individual basis. It suggests consciousness is more interpersonal than we typically assume, more dependent on social interaction, more collective than individual. Consciousness might be the universe's way of combating entropy, creating local pockets of order and meaning in a cosmos trending toward disorder. The second law of thermodynamics states that entropy always increases, yet life and consciousness create order, structure, complexity. Consciousness might be the universe's most sophisticated ordering process, creating meaning and purpose in a meaningless, purposeless cosmos. This theory gives consciousness cosmic significance, suggesting awareness is not incidental but essential, not accidental but necessary. The universe generates consciousness to resist its own tendency toward disorder, to create islands of meaning in an ocean of entropy. Consciousness would be the universe's rebellion against its own laws, matter organizing itself in ways that temporarily reverse entropy's flow. The theory is more poetic than scientific, offering narrative rather than mechanism, meaning rather than explanation. Yet it provides a perspective that makes consciousness feel important, significant, necessary. We're not just products of physical processes, but participants in the universe's struggle against entropy, creators of order and meaning. The theory transforms consciousness from puzzle to purpose, from mystery to mission. The zombie argument suggests that philosophical zombies are conceivable, and if conceivable, then possibly real, and if possibly real, then consciousness is not physical. A zombie is a being physically identical to a conscious person, but lacking subjective experience, behaving identically but experiencing nothing. If such beings are conceivable without contradiction, then consciousness is not necessitated by physical structure, suggesting dualism or non-physicalism. Physicalists respond that zombies are not genuinely conceivable, that conceivability doesn't entail possibility, or that the argument rests on flawed intuitions. The zombie argument has generated enormous debate, with no consensus emerging. It highlights the intuition that consciousness seems separable from physical structure, that we can imagine all the physical facts being the same while consciousness differs. Yet intuitions might mislead us, and conceivability might not track possibility. The argument reveals deep disagreements about consciousness's nature, about whether it's physical or something more. It shows that even clear thinking about consciousness leads to paradox and confusion, that our best philosophical tools struggle to capture consciousness's nature. The zombie walks through philosophy, neither alive nor dead, neither real nor impossible, a thought experiment that refuses resolution. Consciousness might be a strange loop, a self-referential pattern that creates itself through its own operations. Douglas Hofstadter proposed that consciousness arises from tangled hierarchies, systems that contain themselves, that refer to themselves, that create themselves through self-reference. The self is a strange loop, a pattern that emerges from the brain's self-representation, creating the illusion of a homunculus, a little person inside, when really there's just loops of self-reference. Consciousness would be what it's like to be a strange loop, to be a system that observes itself observing, that thinks about itself thinking, that represents itself representing. The theory explains consciousness's reflexivity. its self-awareness, its ability to take itself as its own object. It suggests consciousness is fundamentally paradoxical, neither purely subject nor purely object, but both simultaneously. Strange loops create the sense of an I, a perspective, a center of experience, even though there's no actual center. Just loops of reference creating the illusion of a point from which everything is experienced. The theory is beautiful and strange, suggesting consciousness is a kind of magic trick, a self-creating pattern that emerges from self-reference. Yet it doesn't fully explain why strange loops should feel like anything, why self-reference should create subjective experience. Consciousness might be what information integration feels like, with different types of integration creating different types of consciousness. Integrated information theory proposes that consciousness is identical to integrated information, measured by a quantity called phi. Systems with high phi are highly conscious. Systems with low phi are minimally conscious. Systems with zero phi are unconscious. The theory provides mathematical tools to measure consciousness, suggesting it's quantifiable and objective. What makes consciousness special is not its substrate or its function, but its informational structure, specifically how information is integrated. A system is conscious to the degree that it integrates information, creating a unified whole that's more than the sum of its parts. The theory has controversial implications. It suggests consciousness is widespread, present in any system integrating information, potentially including thermostats and atoms. Yet it provides precise predictions about consciousness's neural correlates, explaining why certain brain structures support consciousness while others don't. The theory transforms consciousness from mystery to mathematics, from ineffable quality to measurable quantity. Critics argue it conflates correlation with identity, assuming that integrated information is consciousness, rather than just correlating with consciousness. Yet the theory offers rigorous tools for studying consciousness scientifically. Consciousness might be the brain's user interface, a simplified representation of complex underlying processes optimized for efficient interaction. Donald Hoffman proposes that evolution shaped perception to hide reality's complexity, creating a user interface that shows only fitness-relevant information. We don't perceive reality as it is, but as a useful fiction, a desktop interface hiding the complex code underneath. Consciousness would be this interface, a representation optimized for survival rather than truth. Space and time might be interface elements, not fundamental reality. Objects might be interface icons, not real things. Consciousness shows us what we need to know, not what's actually there. This theory suggests consciousness is fundamentally illusory, a convenient fiction masking reality's true nature. Yet even if consciousness is an interface, the interface itself is real, and the experience is genuine. The theory explains why consciousness seems irreducible. We're trying to understand the interface using the interface itself, like trying to understand a computer by studying the desktop. Reality's true nature might be inaccessible, forever hidden behind consciousness's user interface. The theory is radical, suggesting everything we experience is illusory, but it offers a framework for understanding why consciousness seems mysterious. We're fundamentally confused about what we're experiencing. Consciousness might be a quantum measurement process, with the brain collapsing quantum superpositions through observation. In quantum mechanics, measurement collapses superpositions into definite states, and some theories propose that consciousness is what performs this collapse. The brain would be a quantum measuring device, and consciousness is the collapse itself. The moment possibilities become actualities. This theory connects consciousness to quantum mechanics measurement problem, suggesting awareness is the mechanism by which the quantum world becomes classical. Consciousness would be fundamental to physics, not just biology, essential to reality's structure. The theory is controversial, with most physicists rejecting it, but it offers an intriguing connection between consciousness and quantum mechanics. If true, consciousness would be woven into the fabric of reality, essential to the universe's operation. The brain would be performing quantum measurements constantly, collapsing possibilities into experiences. Yet the theory faces serious problems. Quantum effects seem too fragile to survive in warm brains, and it's unclear why collapse should create consciousness rather than just physical outcomes. The theory suggests consciousness touches reality's deepest levels, but struggles to make this connection plausible. Consciousness might be an evolutionary spandrel, a byproduct of other adaptations rather than an adaptation itself. Spandrels are architectural features that arise as necessary consequences of other design decisions, not because they serve functions themselves. Consciousness might be similar, a necessary consequence of complex information processing, not something evolution selected for directly. The brain evolved to process information, to generate flexible behavior, to learn and adapt, and consciousness emerged as a side effect. This theory suggests consciousness has no function, no purpose, no adaptive value. It exists because brains complex enough to support it evolved for other reasons. The theory is deflationary, removing consciousness's apparent significance, making it incidental rather than essential. Yet even if consciousness is a spandrel, it's a remarkable one, perhaps the most interesting byproduct in the universe. The theory challenges the assumption that everything must have a function, suggesting some features exist simply because they are inevitable consequences of other features. Consciousness might be such an inevitable consequence, emerging whenever information processing reaches sufficient complexity. The theory makes consciousness less mysterious by making it less special, just another physical phenomenon without deeper significance. If you've drifted in and out, that's perfect. These theories are companions, keeping you company as you drift, asking nothing, demanding nothing, just offering gentle wonder. Consciousness might be the brain's way of creating a temporal thickness, binding past and future into an extended present moment. William James described the specious present, the felt duration of now, which spans several seconds rather than being instantaneous. Consciousness creates this extended present, integrating recent past and near future into a unified moment. Without this temporal thickness, experience would be a series of disconnected instants, lacking continuity and flow. Consciousness binds time, creating the sense of duration, of things happening rather than just being. This temporal binding might be essential to consciousness, explaining why awareness always has a temporal structure, why experiences unfold rather than occurring instantaneously. The theory suggests consciousness is fundamentally temporal, inseparable from time's flow. Different states of consciousness might involve different temporal structures. Normal waking consciousness has one temporal thickness. Altered states might compress or expand it. Time itself might be a construction of consciousness, not something consciousness exists within, but something consciousness creates. The theory connects consciousness to time in deep ways, suggesting awareness and temporality are intertwined. That understanding one requires understanding the other. Yet it doesn't explain why temporal binding should feel like anything, why creating an extended present should produce subjective experience. Consciousness might be substrate dependent after all, requiring specific biological materials and processes that cannot be replicated in other media. This biological naturalism suggests consciousness depends on specific causal powers of neurons, properties that arise from their biological nature and cannot be captured by functional descriptions. Silicon computers might replicate neural functions without replicating consciousness, because consciousness depends on biology's specific causal powers. John Searle argued that consciousness is as biological as digestion, depending on specific physical processes that cannot be abstracted away. This theory challenges functionalism, suggesting consciousness is not just about information processing patterns, but about specific biological implementations. It implies consciousness cannot be uploaded, that artificial intelligence cannot be genuinely conscious, that consciousness is tied to carbon-based life. Critics argue this is biological chauvinism, privileging our particular implementation without justification. But biological naturalists respond that consciousness might genuinely depend on specific materials, that not everything is substrate independent. The theory grounds consciousness in biology, in the messy reality of organic processes, suggesting consciousness is more physical than functionalists assume, yet it struggles to explain what specific biological properties matter, what neurons do that silicon cannot replicate. Consciousness might be nature's solution to the frame problem, the challenge of determining which information is relevant in any given situation. Artificial intelligence struggles with relevance. Given unlimited information, how does a system determine what matters? Consciousness might solve this problem through subjective experience, through feelings that highlight relevant information. Emotions flag important information. Attention focuses on relevant features. Consciousness creates a subjective perspective that automatically determines relevance. Without consciousness, systems must explicitly compute relevance, which is computationally intractable. With consciousness, relevance is immediate, felt, obvious. This theory makes consciousness functionally essential, solving a problem that plagues artificial systems. It explains why consciousness is selective, why we're not aware of everything, why attention focuses awareness. Consciousness creates relevance through subjective experience, through the feeling that some things matter more than others. The theory connects consciousness to meaning and significance, suggesting awareness is fundamentally about determining what matters, yet it doesn't fully explain how subjective experience solves the frame problem, how feelings determine relevance, how consciousness makes the computationally intractable tractable. The theory describes consciousness's function without fully explaining its mechanism. Consciousness might be a form of self-organizing complexity that emerges at critical points in dynamical systems, where the system is poised between order and chaos. Complex systems can exhibit emergent properties at these critical points, where small changes cascade through the system, creating rich dynamics. Consciousness might be such an emergent property, arising when neural networks reach critical complexity. The brain self-organizes to this critical point, maintaining the delicate balance where consciousness emerges. Too much order creates rigidity, too much chaos creates noise, but at the critical point, the system exhibits maximal complexity and flexibility. This theory connects consciousness to complexity science, suggesting awareness is a general property of complex systems at criticality. It implies consciousness might exist in other complex systems, not just brains, wherever criticality emerges. The theory explains consciousness's fragility, why it's easily disrupted, why it requires specific conditions. Moving away from criticality eliminates consciousness, pushing the system into either rigid order or random chaos. Yet the theory doesn't explain why criticality should feel like anything, why complex dynamics should create subjective experience. It describes consciousness's physical substrate without explaining its phenomenal nature. Consciousness might be the brain's way of creating a sense of agency, the feeling that we're causing our actions rather than just observing them. This sense of agency is essential for functioning, for learning, for social interaction. Without it, we'd feel like passive observers of our own lives, like passengers rather than drivers. Consciousness creates this sense by generating the feeling of willing, the experience of choosing. Even if the actual causation is unconscious and deterministic, the sense of agency might be an illusion, but it's a necessary one, essential for adaptive behavior. The theory explains why consciousness is tied to action, why awareness increases when we're acting rather than passively observing. It explains why damage to certain brain areas disrupts the sense of agency, creating the feeling that someone else is controlling one's actions. Consciousness would be the brain's way of attributing actions to the self, creating the narrative that we're in control. Yet even if the sense of agency is illusory, the experience itself is real, and the feeling of causing our actions is genuine. The theory suggests consciousness serves a narrative function, creating coherent stories about our actions, making us feel like unified agents rather than collections of competing processes. Consciousness might be what it's like to be a prediction error minimization system, constantly trying to reduce surprises and maintain expected patterns. The brain is always predicting incoming sensory data, and consciousness arises from the process of comparing predictions to reality and updating models. We become conscious of prediction errors, of things that violate expectations, that require model revision. Consciousness would be the subjective side of predictive processing, the feeling of surprise, the sense of learning, the experience of updating beliefs. This theory connects consciousness to learning and adaptation, suggesting awareness exists to facilitate model revision. It explains why consciousness is selective, focusing on novelty and surprise while ignoring predictable patterns. It explains why consciousness varies in intensity, stronger for large prediction errors, weaker for small ones. The theory makes consciousness functionally essential, necessary for adaptive behavior in unpredictable environments. Yet it doesn't explain why prediction error minimization should feel like anything, why model updating should have subjective character. The theory describes when consciousness occurs without explaining what consciousness is, its timing without its nature. Still, it offers insights into consciousness's relationship to learning and surprise. Consciousness might be the brain's way of simulating possible futures, creating virtual realities to test actions before executing them. This simulation theory suggests consciousness is a modeling system, creating internal representations of possible scenarios. We experience these simulations as conscious thoughts, as imagined possibilities, as mental rehearsals. Consciousness would be the subjective side of simulation, what it feels like to run virtual scenarios. The theory explains why consciousness is often future-oriented, why we spend so much time imagining possibilities, why mental simulation is so important for planning and decision-making. It explains why consciousness can operate independently of current sensory input, creating imagined worlds disconnected from immediate perception. The brain uses consciousness to explore possibilities without risking actual action, testing strategies virtually before implementing them physically. This theory makes consciousness functionally valuable, essential for flexible behavior in complex environments. Yet it doesn't explain why simulation should feel like anything, why virtual scenarios should have subjective character. The theory describes consciousness's function without explaining its phenomenology, what it does without what it is. Still, it connects consciousness to imagination and planning, suggesting awareness is fundamentally about exploring possibilities. Consciousness might be a form of integrated information that creates a unified perspective, a single point of view from which the world is experienced. This unity of consciousness is one of its most striking features. Despite being generated by billions of neurons, consciousness feels singular, unified, coherent. The binding problem asks how this unity arises from neural multiplicity. Some theories propose that integrated information creates unity, that consciousness is unified because information is integrated, bound together into a single system. The more integrated the information, the more unified the consciousness. This explains why consciousness feels like a single thing rather than multiple things, why we experience one world from one perspective rather than multiple worlds from multiple perspectives. Yet the theory struggles to explain how integration creates unity, how many become one, how physical separation becomes experiential wholeness. The unity of consciousness remains mysterious, a feature we experience directly but cannot fully explain. The theory describes what needs explaining without fully explaining it, naming the mystery without solving it. Still, it highlights consciousness's remarkable unity. The way billions of processes create a single experience. We're near the end now, Let the final theories wash over you like gentle waves, carrying you deeper into rest, into calm, into the soft embrace of sleep. Consciousness might be the brain's way of creating meaning through embodied simulation, grounding abstract concepts in sensory and motor experiences. When we understand language, we simulate the described situations using sensory and motor systems. When we think about concepts, we reactivate the bodily experiences associated with those concepts. Consciousness would be this embodied simulation, the reactivation of sensory motor patterns. Understanding is not abstract computation, but grounded in bodily experience, in the feeling of acting and perceiving. This theory suggests consciousness is fundamentally embodied, inseparable from sensory motor systems. Abstract thought is possible only because it's grounded in concrete bodily experience. We understand grasping an idea by simulating grasping with our hands. We understand bright future by simulating visual brightness. Consciousness creates meaning by linking concepts to bodily experiences, making abstract thought feel like something. The theory explains consciousness's rich phenomenology, why experiences have sensory qualities, why understanding feels like something. Yet it doesn't fully explain how simulation creates consciousness, why reactivating patterns should feel like anything. The theory connects consciousness to embodiment without fully explaining the connection. Consciousness might be what it's like to be a system that models itself, that represents its own states to itself. Self-modeling creates consciousness, the subjective experience of being a system that knows itself. The brain builds models of the external world, but it also builds models of itself, representing its own states, its own processes, its own existence. Consciousness is this self-model, the brain's representation of itself. When the brain models itself, it creates the experience of being someone, of having a perspective, of existing as a subject. The self-model creates the sense of I, the feeling of being a unified agent, even though the reality is multiple processes. This theory explains consciousness's reflexivity, its self-awareness, its ability to take itself as its own object. It explains why consciousness seems to have a perspective, a point of view, a center. The self-model creates this center, this perspective, this sense of location. Yet the theory doesn't explain why self-modeling should feel like anything, why representing oneself should create subjective experience. It describes consciousness's structure without explaining its phenomenology, what it is without why it feels like anything. Still, it offers insights into consciousness's self-referential nature. Consciousness might be the universe's way of experiencing itself, matter becoming aware of its own existence through organized complexity. This panpsychist view suggests consciousness is fundamental, present everywhere in some form, and human consciousness is simply what universal consciousness becomes when organized through brains. We are the universe's way of knowing itself, experiencing itself, understanding itself. Every conscious being is a window through which existence peers at its own reflection. This theory gives consciousness cosmic significance, suggesting awareness is not incidental but essential, not accidental but fundamental. The universe has never been unconscious, never been dead, always aware in some form. Human consciousness is simply a particularly rich expression of something universal and eternal. The theory is more philosophy than science, offering perspective rather than mechanism, meaning rather than explanation. Yet it provides a framework that makes consciousness feel less isolated, less separate, more connected to everything. We're not alone in awareness, but are expressions of universal consciousness, temporary individuations of something vast and eternal. The theory transforms consciousness from puzzle to poetry, from problem to perspective. Consciousness might be a quantum field that pervades space, and brains are simply receivers tuning into this universal awareness. This speculative theory suggests consciousness is not generated by brains, but accessed through them. Like radios receiving broadcasts, the consciousness field exists everywhere, always, and different brain configurations tune into different aspects of it. Damage to the brain doesn't destroy consciousness but disrupts reception, like damaging a radio doesn't destroy the broadcast. This theory explains why consciousness seems irreducible to neural activity. It's not produced by neurons but accessed through them. It suggests consciousness is fundamental, universal, eternal, and brains are simply interfaces allowing universal consciousness to manifest as individual awareness. The theory is deeply controversial, lacking empirical support, but it offers a beautiful vision of consciousness as something vast and unified, something we all share. We're not separate islands of awareness, but expressions of universal consciousness, temporary individuations of something eternal. The theory transforms death from ending to transformation, from loss to return, suggesting consciousness continues beyond individual brains. Yet it remains speculative, more poetry than science, more hope than evidence. Consciousness might be the brain's way of creating a narrative self, a story that connects experiences across time into coherent identity. We experience ourselves as continuous persons, but this continuity might be constructed through narrative, through the stories we tell about ourselves. Memory provides the material, consciousness weaves it into narrative, creating the sense of being someone with a past and future. The narrative self is not a thing, but a process, not an entity, but a story, constantly revised and updated. Consciousness creates this narrative to make sense of experiences, to connect past and future, to create coherent identity. Without narrative, experiences would be disconnected, lacking the unity we associate with personal identity. The theory explains why the self feels substantial, yet proves elusive when examined closely. It's narrative, not substance, story rather than thing. Yet even if the self is narrative, the narrative itself is real, and the experience of being someone is genuine. The theory reconceives the self without eliminating it, transforming it from entity to process, from substance to story. The self becomes something we do rather than something we are, a continuous creation rather than a fixed fact. Consciousness might be what information integration feels like from the inside, the subjective experience of being a unified system processing information. When information is integrated, when separate processes bind into unified wholes, consciousness emerges. The more integrated the information, the richer the consciousness. This theory suggests consciousness is ubiquitous, present wherever information integrates, but varying in richness and complexity. Simple systems have minimal consciousness. Complex systems have rich consciousness. The theory makes consciousness measurable, quantifiable, objective. It provides mathematical tools to calculate consciousness, to measure its presence and intensity. Yet it faces the hard problem. Why should information integration feel like anything? Why should physical processes create subjective experience? The theory describes consciousness's structure without explaining its phenomenology, its organization without its essence. Still, it offers a framework for studying consciousness scientifically, for measuring and predicting it, for understanding its neural basis. The theory transforms consciousness from mystery to mathematics, from ineffable quality to measurable quantity, from philosophical puzzle to scientific problem. Consciousness might be the brain's way of creating a sense of presence, the feeling of existing here and now, the awareness of being alive in this moment. This sense of presence is fundamental to consciousness, the feeling that we're here, that we exist, that we're experiencing something. Without presence, there might be information processing but not consciousness, computation but not awareness. Presence creates the sense of being someone somewhere, of occupying a perspective, of existing as a subject. The theory suggests consciousness is fundamentally about presence, about the feeling of being here now. Different states of consciousness involve different senses of presence. Normal waking consciousness has strong presence. Dreams have altered presence. Deep sleep has no presence. Presence might be what distinguishes conscious from unconscious processing, what makes some information processing feel like something. Yet the theory doesn't explain how presence arises, how the brain creates this sense of being here now. It names the essential feature without explaining its origin. Still, it highlights something important about consciousness, its fundamental character as presence, as the feeling of existing here and now. Consciousness might be an emergent property of complex adaptive systems, arising when systems reach sufficient complexity and self-organization. Emergence theory suggests that at certain levels of complexity, new properties appear that cannot be predicted from studying components in isolation. Consciousness would be such an emergent property, arising when neural networks reach critical complexity. The theory explains why consciousness seems irreducible, why we can't find it by studying individual neurons. It's not in the parts, but in the relationships between parts, in the patterns they form. Yet emergence remains somewhat mysterious, a label for something we don't fully understand. We can describe emergence without explaining it, observe it without predicting it. The theory names the mystery without solving it, offering a framework rather than an answer. Still, it suggests consciousness is natural, physical, arising from ordinary processes when they reach extraordinary complexity. Consciousness becomes less mysterious by becoming more ordinary, less special by becoming more natural. The theory grounds consciousness in physical processes while acknowledging its emergent, irreducible character. Consciousness might be what it's like to be a living system, maintaining itself through continuous exchange with the environment. Life is characterized by autopoiesis, self-creation, self-maintenance through metabolic processes. Consciousness might be the subjective side of autopoiesis, what it feels like to be a self-maintaining system. This theory connects consciousness to life, suggesting awareness is fundamentally biological, inseparable from living processes. Consciousness exists to help organisms maintain themselves, to feel what the body needs, to guide behavior towards survival. Every living system has some form of consciousness, some feeling of its own existence, some sense of its own needs. Human consciousness is simply a particularly rich expression of something present in all life. The theory makes consciousness ubiquitous in the living world, present wherever life exists. It grounds consciousness in biology, in the basic processes of self-maintenance and survival. Yet it doesn't explain why self-maintenance should feel like anything, why autopoiesis should create subjective experience. The theory connects consciousness to life without fully explaining the connection. Still, it offers a framework that makes consciousness feel less isolated, less separate, more connected to all living things. And so, our quiet journey through consciousness comes to a gentle close. We've travelled far tonight, from neural patterns to quantum mysteries, from embodied cognition to universal awareness, touching on questions that have puzzled humanity for millennia. The theories behind us now, like stars fading into dawn. Some theories offered answers, others only deeper questions. Some felt solid, others shimmered like mirages, but all of them carried a piece of humanity's endless curiosity, our refusal to accept the world at face value, our need to wonder. These theories, some ancient and some born yesterday, represent our attempts to understand the most intimate mystery of all, what it's like to be someone, to experience something, to be aware. Theories are strange things. They're not quite facts, not quite fantasies. They live in the space between what we know and what we imagine. They're humanity's way of reaching toward truth with imperfect hands, building bridges across chasms of ignorance. Some will be proven right, others will fade. But the reaching itself, The wondering never stops. If your eyes are already heavy, that's just fine. Perfect even. Let the last traces of neural networks and quantum fields fade behind your thoughts, becoming less distinct, less important. Let your breath carry you softly into rest, each exhale releasing a little more tension, each inhale drawing you deeper into calm. There's still so much more to discover, endless theories waiting, but for now, you've learned enough. You've wondered enough. You've travelled far through mysteries and questions, and consciousness can wait until morning. Patient and unchanging, ready whenever you return. You don't need to remember any of this. Not the names, not the details, not even the theories themselves. They were never meant to be memorized, only experienced, like watching clouds drift across the sky. What matters is not what you retain, but how you felt while listening. The gentle stimulation of curiosity, the soft pleasure of learning, the quiet comfort of questions asked in darkness. That's enough. That's everything. Notice how your body has grown heavier as we've talked, how your muscles have softened, how even the weight of your thoughts has decreased. This is the natural rhythm of rest, the way consciousness gradually releases its grip, letting you drift. You don't need to force it. You don't need to try. Just allow it, the way you'd allow yourself to float in calm water, trusting the water to hold you, trusting the darkness to be safe. There's nothing you need to do now. No answers to chase, no puzzles to solve, no theories to understand. Just the calm certainty that mystery itself is a kind of lullaby, one that will carry you into sleep. So let go. Let your mind wander where it will, through dreams or darkness, through memories or nothing at all. Thank you for spending this time with me, for letting me guide you through these theories, these questions, these mysteries. Thank you for your curiosity, for your willingness to wonder, for choosing to end your day with learning rather than emptiness. It means something, this choice you've made. It says something about who you are, someone who seeks understanding even in the quiet moments before sleep. And I'm grateful to be part of your evening, part of your routine, part of the quiet ritual that carries you from waking into sleep. You're not alone in this. Right now, all across the world, others are listening too, drifting through these same theories, wondering these same questions. Some are ahead of you, already deep in dreams. Others are just beginning. But you're all connected by this shared experience, this common journey through mystery and wonder. A quiet community of curious minds, seeking rest and knowledge in the same breath, finding peace in questions that have no answers. Tomorrow night, if you wish, we'll explore other mysteries, other questions, other theories, but that's tomorrow. Tonight is for rest, for dreams, for letting go of everything except the gentle pull of sleep. Imagine yourself now, floating through the theories we've explored, passing by them as if through constellations in the night. Questions above, questions below, a galaxy of wonder all around you. And you at the quiet centre, resting in the knowledge that mystery is not something to fear, but something to embrace. That not knowing is not failure, but invitation. That the universe keeps secrets not to frustrate us, but to keep us curious, to keep us reaching, to keep us human. Let that thought comfort you. Let it wrap around you like a blanket woven from starlight and uncertainty, soft and strange and somehow perfect. The theories we've explored tonight are just whispers in an infinite conversation, questions asked across time, mysteries that connect us all. There's nothing left to do now, no answers to chase, no puzzles to solve, no theories to understand. Just the calm certainty that mystery itself is a kind of lullaby, one that will carry you into sleep. So let go. Let your mind wander where it will, through dreams or darkness, through memories or nothing at all. Let your consciousness dim like a sunset, gradually, naturally, beautifully. And know that when you wake, the theories will still be here, The questions will still wait, and the universe will still be strange and wonderful. I hope you sleep well and dream softly. May your rest be deep, your dreams be gentle, and your tomorrow be bright. Thank you for being here. Good night.